To begin this video, I have a brand new document open, and what I want to do is I want to come over here and switch to our pastel. Now, what I want to primarily point out to you is that we are going to have less sliders here than what we saw with our acrylics. I also want you to make sure that we're seeing this at the default, so I'm going to come over here to the flyout and say reset properties so that everything is at the default. And I'm going to go ahead and choose the square hard. The reason why is because the settings that we're going to get as we're changing these guys here is going to interact with the settings of the brushes themselves. And therefore, we're not going to get the same results for all the brushes, even at the same settings for the properties here. The other thing that I want to point out to you is that there's no water in the pastels. And as a result, we don't have the various different brush modes. So we're not going to be worrying about blending with these guys. The only brush mode that we have here is the erase mode. So I'm going to come over here and just increase the size a bit. And what I want to do is I want to paint with this gray blue that I have down here on the document real quick. And I just want you to see that this is sort of the default mark that we're going to get at a pressure of 50. However, if I decrease the pressure, I'm going to get more of a hard pastel look, something like that right there. And if I increase the pressure, you're going to see I get more of a soft pastel look where we're filling up that texture much more rapidly. So the idea is that if you want a harder pastel, reduce the pressure. If you want a softer pastel, increase the pressure. But generally speaking, I find that using it somewhere around the pressure of 50 is probably going to be the best idea. This way you get the natural response from the individual brushes themselves. The next thing that I want to do is I want to come over here and clear this, and I'm going to choose a color of white. And I'm going to go ahead and paint a bunch of white down here. And the reason why I do that is to fill in the texture of the paper with the pastel. Now, this is a unique property of pastel is the fact that we can, in fact, fill in that paper texture. And this is something that's going to be revealed to us by switching over to a gray blue and then doing a stroke over the top of this. So you can see that we're going to get a very different character to our brush mark as we're going over areas of blank paper versus when we have filled in that canvas texture. You can see we get a much softer mark. And then as soon as we hit blank paper again, it's going back to that grainy appearance. We can see this very clearly by coming over here and scrubbing like so. And then as soon as I hit the area where the white was, you can see I get a much softer looking mark. So there's a very different character to our pastels in areas where we filled in the paper texture versus areas where we have not. This is very true to life, and it's one of the things that makes the pastel different from the pencil, the marker, and the airbrush. So an important thing to remember, and also something that is going to make your pastel drawings look a lot more true to life. Now I'm going to come over here and clear this out, and I want to come over here and begin to draw in some of this blue, and then I'm going to come over and talk about the idea of the fact that we're still inside the fluid simulation, even though we're working with what is a dry media. So if I come over here to our water, and I come over and I increase the amount of water, and then I come over here to our tilt, and I enable the tilt so it has a slight downward tilt, and I come over here and I paint down some water onto this, and I let that diffuse, and I just turn off the visibility. You can see that we are in fact diffusing that pastel out, and it's dripping down, just like what we would expect. However, you're going to notice that the diffusion that we get is going to have a drier character to it than the diffusion that we would get with watercolor or acrylic. It's going to have a different feel to it. So even though it's wet here, it's still going to feel kind of dry in the way that it diffuses. And this is one of the beautiful things about working with these dry media with Rebelle is you can wet them, but they still have a different feel to them than watercolor does. And so you'll want to bear that in mind. Another way that we can use this is we could do the opposite. So I'm going to come over here and pause the diffusion, and I'm going to go ahead and paint down some water like so. And then what I want to do is I want to come back over here to pastel, and I'm going to go ahead and view that wetness. And I'm going to go ahead and paint down some blue, first of all, into that. And I want you to see that it's going to dry out that water to a certain degree because it's a dry media. And then I'm also going to switch over here to a gray red, and I'm going to paint some of that in there. And I'm going to go over here and turn off the view wet. So you can see we have these two colors. They appear to be dry, and they are dry to a certain extent, but they're painted into a puddle of wetness. So when I unpause, these two are going to diffuse out, and they're going to become more of a wet look to them because of that diffusion process, but they're still going to be dry. And as a matter of fact, if I come over here and I view the wet, you'll see where there was a thick buildup of that density or structure for the pastel. It's really drying out, and it's not allowing that to stay wet. It's really only being wet at the edges of that. So this is something that you want to bear in mind is that even though we can wet it, inherently it is a dry media and it has thickness to it. It remembers that thickness, and so when we wet it, it's going to respect and it's going to play with that thickness, and it's also going to diffuse in a way that has a very dry quality to it. So again, a very different type of media than what we get with watercolor or acrylics because it's inherently dry and it does track the density of that dry pigment buildup. Now, that said, there's one more thing I want to talk about here, and that's going to be the fact that we're working with the white canvas. If I come over and I switch to a different color canvas, we're going to see a very different result. This is typically what we would see with pastels. So if you're thinking about trying the pastel medium, go ahead and start with a toned ground like what we have here, and then go ahead and build up your pastels using the toned ground as part of the coloration of the final document. And you'll find that you're going to end up with pastel drawings that look much more like real world pastel drawings.